week. But chapter 2 kind of separates itself from all of the political intrigue that is going on in Israel and does a kind of a refocus on Elijah for the last time. Elijah is about to be out of the picture here, so if you got tired of me talking about Elijah, well, we'll soon be done with Elijah. He's going to go away here. And I'm going to refer to this as the departure of Elijah, because death is not really the right word, and we'll kind of talk about that here. But we're gonna focus on Elijah and Elisha here for this chapter, and we will basically be following Elisha and the times that he continues in for the rest of this study after chapter 2. So let's go ahead and get into it. If someone to read for us 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 1 through 7, please. 1 through 7. Okay, so these opening 7 verses are kind of tells us everything about what's about to happen. There's not really any spoilers in here, but we get some interesting details and our setup here. So verse 1 really just kind of ruins it. If you hadn't read the chapter before, you don't know what happens to Elijah. It's going to tell you right in verse 1, the Lord's going to take Elijah away in a whirlwind. So when we get to that point here in the chapter where it actually happens, well, yeah, that was going to happen. We were told that was going to happen. I think that's an interesting way for the chapter to open. We'll discuss that whole mechanics of that later when we get to that. But basically from the end of verse 1 here through verse 6, we see sort of a pattern going on. Elijah says he's going to go somewhere, and then he tells Elijah tells Elisha to stay there while he goes on. And Elisha insists that he's going to go wherever Elijah goes, and then they both go to that place. Then a group of prophets will approach Elisha and say, hey, do you know that Elijah is going to be taken away from you today by God? And Elisha is going to say, yeah, I know, don't talk about it, don't speak of it. And this repeats itself multiple times. I'm not sure why the repetition is included here, but I think the detail kind of proves that this is something that was happening and was going to happen. So they start at Gilgal, they go to Bethel, they go to Jericho, and then they go to the Jordan River. So they kind of make almost, I would call it a world tour, but it's not a world. It's just the country of Israel and Judah. They're going from the north all the way down the south, and they're kind of making almost a loop here by the time they get to the Jordan River. Now, I'm not exactly sure, because it doesn't tell us how Elisha knows this is about to happen. Certainly we get some indication later on that Elijah knows that he's going to be taken away on this day. We're not sure how these prophets in these various cities know that Elijah is going to be taken away. We're not told how they know that. But it's clear they all seem to know that. They all seem to understand that that's going to be the case. So I don't really have much more to say about that because I don't know how. But I do know that that is the case. That this is going to happen. They all know that. And one other thing I do want to point out here with Elisha following Elijah everywhere he goes in these verses kind of adds to the idea that Elisha has been with Elijah the entire time since the end of 1 Kings chapter 19. Even though when we see Elijah mentioned after that point, Elisha is not mentioned as being with him. But I think from the end of chapter 19 and the verses we see here in this chapter of 2 Kings, that would be consistent that Elisha would have been with Elijah, like when Elijah's in the vineyard of Naboth, when he's approaching Ahab, and when the king Ahaziah sends troops at Elijah when he's on top of the hill to go get him. I imagine Elisha is there with him. That would make sense. That would be consistent. He's just not mentioned. He's not the one they're really looking for. He's not as important. He's not prevalent. He's not doing these actions that Elijah is. But I think he is there. That is, again, kind of my opinion on it, I guess, because Scripture does not tell us either way in those instances, because he's not mentioned either way of being there or not being there. But in my mind, this kind of adds to the probability that Elisha has been with Elijah in each of those circumstances, just not mentioned by name. So every time we've been talking about Elijah since chapter 19 of 1 Kings, I've been kind of mentioning that. But this is another reason why I think that. I'm not just, supposing it in my own head for no evidence there. This is kind of another reason I think that. By the time we get to the end of verse 7 that we read, Elijah and Elisha have both stopped at the Jordan River, and it seems that 50 men from the company of the prophets of Jericho have sort of followed in behind after them from a distance. And I suppose it's Jericho because that's the last city mentioned. That would have not been an extreme trek from Jericho to the Jordan River. And Jericho is going to get mentioned later on in this chapter again. And so it doesn't say specifically Jericho, but I'm pretty sure that's who we're talking about by the time we get to verse 7. So that's our setup for this chapter. Any comments, thoughts, questions before we kind of move into the meat of what happens? Go ahead, Pat.
It seems to me that Elisha is a student of Elijah, and so he's like tending to the teacher, and so he wouldn't be mentioned a lot because of his status.
Yeah, and that's why I tend to think he's not mentioned. And the end of 1 Kings chapter 19 tells us that he attended to Elijah from that point onward. So it makes me think, he was probably with him, but he's just not mentioned because he's not the guy, that everyone's looking for. He's not the one doing the miraculous signs yet. But that's kind of the same thing, I think, is just he's not the one, he's not the teacher, he's not the rabbi, he's not the prophet that everyone's looking to, which is why he's not mentioned. But I don't think the lack of his name being mentioned doesn't mean he was there. And again, this is one reason why I think this is he's going with him wherever he goes. He doesn't seem to sway. And he says, as long as the Lord lives, as long as you live, I'm going to be with you. I'm going with you. So those are not empty words. He is saying very strong words. He's very adamant about this. It's not something that's like, oh yeah, have a good time. I'll see you when you get back. He's going where he goes. We might talk a little bit more about that as we continue on. Good thought. Any other comments we want to make before we continue? Okay, let's read. Someone read for us verses 8 through 10, please. 8 through 10. Okay, so there's some interesting things mentioned here. This is why we didn't want to read too many before we continued on. Verse 8, we see Elijah. He strikes the Jordan River with his cloak. I think Jeff's translation used the term mantle. I'm going to call it cloak because that's what it says in my translation. That's what I wrote in my notes. But we're talking about an article of clothing here. And the river divides and they cross on dry ground. Now, have we ever seen something like that before where a body of water divides and they cross on dry ground. Has that ever happened before? All right, what are some instances where something like that happens? Okay, the crossing of the Red Sea under who? Moses. So we have all the plagues of Egypt. Pharaoh finally says, okay, get out of here. And Moses and the Israelites head to the promised land. And one of the first obstacles, I suppose, they come to is the Red Sea. And now Pharaoh and his army is pursuing them because he changes his mind. And they kind of think all is lost here. And there is, the New Testament talks about the crossing of the Red Sea in a lot more significant symbolic terms. I'm not really going to get into that necessarily, but the fact that that was a major salvation of the Israelites in the literal sense, they did not die. God intervened and protected them, and not only protected them, but destroyed the Egyptians when they tried to do the same. And Moses, of course, is seen by the Israelites as a very important figure. He is the lawgiver. He is an important liberator of the people out of Egypt. So symbolically, being able to cross a body of water like this has some meaning to it. Elijah is not just some guy, some prophet, some person who has this miraculous ability. There's a big deal here with this. Another instance where this happens, and probably some of you remember this also, is the Jordan River gets crossed in Joshua chapter 3 when they take the Ark of the Covenant and they're crossing and they're actually going to Jericho. So they're going the opposite direction here. But the same thing happens. The Levites who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they step foot into the river. The river divides. Well, it describes it as being banked upstream, or however your translation words it. But basically, the water doesn't come down anymore, and they're able to cross the Jordan River. So in each of those cases, you have a very grand showing of the Lord's power here. And so Elijah and Elisha, they do this exact same thing. I mean, this is a big deal. This is not something that happens every day of the week. In fact, and I'm not trying to rank miracles here because I'm not sure that's necessarily appropriate, but we see a lot of people heal the sick. We see a lot of men of God, heal people of leprosy or have some kind of evil spirit about them, things like that. This is a type of miracle that is very rare. There's only happens a few times. So when I think it's interesting that they have these 50 prophets from Jericho who are watching this, they would understand what is happening here. Like, this is sort of a big deal. Go ahead, Jeff, you had your hand up.
1 Corinthians 10 verse 2 says that the Israelites were baptized in the crossing of the Red Sea with the ground below, the cloud of God above, and the water on each side. There's a baptism. So in a sense, that this was their moment of making a commitment to serving God as a nation. Sure, all of them didn't realize that, but many of them did. They're stepping out in faith amidst that water, and it required some faith. Jesus was baptized when he began his ministry, and the Holy Spirit came upon him. I think this is kind of similar to those two things. It is the beginning of Elisha as the spokesman for God, and the work he would begin to do in his ministry, I guess you would say.
Yeah, and there's going to be more to this as we get later on in the chapter. So just kind of remember that this is a big deal. Like, I'll have a little bit more to talk about it kind of on the flip side here when Elisha is doing his return. But this is not like a common thing. This is not something that happened every day. Any prophet could have done. This is a very rarely recorded instance as far as miracles go in Scripture. Very good. Trying to see if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. Okay, so after they cross over, Elijah asks Elisha a question. He asks, is there anything that you want before I'm taken from you, basically? Kind of, here's your last request of me. What do you want it to be? And he says he wants a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And we can kind of look at that terminology and wonder, like, does he want to be like two people? Does he want to be twice as powerful? How do we want to determine what that means to have a double portion of his spirit? And I don't think of this as necessarily being powerful and mighty. I think he's thinking of the faithfulness that Elijah had. Remember, Elijah Elijah's been through a lot here. I mean, living during the time of Ahab was probably enough. But he has been, constantly pursued. He's been an enemy of the state. They've been trying to kill him. He's done all these miraculous signs in front of the people of Israel, in front of Ahab, and they haven't done anything to really turn away from the idol worship, turning away from the Baals. And God's going to take care of that in a way. We'll see when we get to Jehu. That'll be part of this study also. But Elijah has really struggled here, but he's also had some really, for all the low lows he's had some really high highs. Aside from the calling down of fire from heaven, which actually happens multiple times, which we talked about last week, he got to witness the presence of God in chapter 19, which is something that I probably can't comprehend. I probably can't put into words like the way I should. But again, a very rare instance where some of the few people we see recorded that had that kind of experience is Moses. Again, the lawgiver, someone who has an extremely high reputation in the mind of the Israelites. So Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And I think, Elijah, Elisha, the companies of prophets, they all know that Elijah's leaving. So I kind of understand why this question is posed to Elisha. But Elijah says, okay, this is going to be granted. It's a hard thing, but it'll be granted if you are, the way my translation words it is, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours, otherwise not. So I think this is sort of an indication that Elisha's going to have to go the whole way with him to the very end here. And that seems to be something that maybe Elisha would have done anyways, given all the things that he's been saying up to this point. So I'm not sure why that's the requirement, but it shows that Elijah's saying you have to have this dedication to the end, and then you will have this. And we're going to see, of course, when this happens, Elisha doesn't throw his hands up and give up. Elisha goes and he does do some very miraculous things. And I guess I would say even more so than Elijah. We talk about Elijah a lot because he has some really interesting stories, and we learn him as kids. And then, we talk about being taken up, and then Elisha's left behind, and then we just kind of stop talking about Elisha after that. But Elisha goes on and is going to do a lot of miraculous things here. So I think he definitely is going to get granted that double spirit, if you will. But we'll get to that in a second. Any comments, questions up through verse 10? Bethany.
I took Elijah saying that Elisha would get the double portion if he witnessed, as him saying it's not mine to give, that's God's decision to give him the double portion or not. And so he wasn't going to say yes, you can have that, or no, you can have that. He was giving an opportunity for God to show what his
And that may be. Certainly God would have the ability to grant that request. So it may be that when Elijah gives this condition, it may be Elijah speaking for God in this instance. That God is telling me to tell you that you need to be here to witness it as well. So we're not given that much wording. We're not given that much detail. I almost kind of suppose that it's probably the case. I don't think Elijah would speak out of turn or give authority that he doesn't have to give. That would kind of not be in character for Elijah. So that may actually probably be more likely. Jeff, you have your hand up as well.
Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 that we know in part and we prophesy in part. And what that means is the prophets were given what they needed to know at the moment to accomplish God's will. And Peter said that the prophets sought to understand the meaning of these things, and they could not understand them. Angels even sought the meaning of these things and could not understand them. But we are blessed because we have the Bible. Because we have all things that pertain to life and godliness. We difficult that might be. We are blessed to have the understanding from Scripture. No, it doesn't shake the ground and it doesn't change the colors of the sky, but understanding is the most important thing that God can give us. And we are blessed to have that. We have to dig through the Scriptures and look in our hearts and look at life, but we can put it together and be blessed even more than these prophets of old.
Yeah, and especially because we can see how their work develops into the new and better covenant that we have now. And we can see this example on their end too. The prophets really did want to know more. I mean, we have Elijah, back in the beginning of 1 Kings chapter 19, who is seemingly severely depressed because he's done all this miraculous stuff, and yet no one seems to be responding to the message of God. And he says, I'm the only one left, God. You might as well just let me die. And of course, that seems sort of a ridiculous thing to us because, look what Elijah went on to do. Look at all the things that Elisha, went on to do after him. Why would Elijah ever make a statement like he didn't know? He didn't know what God had in store for him. Or we look at Daniel, and we did our study of Daniel not too long ago. Daniel, especially in the second half where you have all these prophecies and stuff, and Daniel's constantly asking questions like, hey, when is this going to happen? What does this mean? How should we know what to do? And basically God tells him at the end, go your way, Daniel. This isn't for you. This isn't your problem to worry about. I'm sure Daniel, and it talks about, physically how he was unable to do his work for a certain time because of the experience was so great, but he didn't have the understanding. That certainly, I think, holds true. And we can look at more examples and scriptures that will prove to us that the revelation of God's plan for salvation was something that all the prophets were looking for. They all saw to an extent of what they were given, but they didn't see what the bigger picture was all the time. And I know they all struggled with that from time to time. Very good. Any other comments on that? Go ahead, Arnold.
The fact that Elijah told him to, to wait until for this sign that he would receive if he was going to be granted his request. So that's similar to what we as Christians should do today, is seek the Lord's on matters that we don't have control over, and things that we really can't understand. We should not, I guess, assume that it's going to happen, but we must ask in order to receive.
And in a way, there's sort of humility to that as well. And goodness knows we need that humility sometimes. Because if we get to the point and we think, well, like we know everything we need to know and we don't need God for this, well, we get to the same problem that the Israelites had where they think they didn't need God anymore. And guess what happened after that? We can talk about the whole cycle of the Judges era where, they think they've got everything under control. They go away from God. Bad things start to happen. Then they turn to God and say, hey, please help us. He delivers them. And then they think they're good again. And so they turn away from God and it happens all over again. And we just get that constant cycle over and over and over again. We definitely need to make sure that we've got that humility. And I think perhaps Elisha's got that too, is he knows that he's not, despite all this time he's spent with Elijah, he is not fully equipped to do the work yet. And you could say maybe that's sort of a similar thing for Solomon, who, being raised in the palace, being the heir to the throne, you're going to get tutoring about how to do king stuff. You're going to know some of these things already by the time you come to the throne. It's not like it was a surprise or anything like that. But he still asks God for wisdom. That's knowing you can't do it all on your own. That's something we should always look for as an example. Very good. Any other comments up through verse 10? Jeff?
One more time.
Okay.
Jesus said in John chapter, I think it's 10, that we are not merely servants of God. Now, I think the metaphor would be that people like Elisha and Elijah were the servants of God. He says, but you are my friends because I am telling you what I am doing. So the blessing of having this understanding and
And yeah, no, I mean, I think you've said it all. I don't think I have any more to add to that. Very good. All right, let's continue on then. Someone read for us verses 11 through 13, please. 11 through 13.
And it came to pass, as they still went on and talked that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elijah saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes, and he rent them into pieces. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back, and he stood by the bank of the Jordan.
Okay. So this is the cool part, where we have all the great artist renditions of how this may have looked, how this happened. I'm sure you've seen artists' depictions of this instance. And of course, again, this is, when we talk about Elijah, typically to kids, it's the showdown of Mount Carmel and then this story that we all get taught. So we probably, a lot of us know this story pretty well. But it seems certainly soon after the words that they exchange in verses 9 and 10, here in verse 11, suddenly this happens where the chariot of fire and horses appear and separates them, and Elijah goes up in the whirlwind, as verse 1 told us was going to happen. So again, we're not surprised here. If we read verse 1, we know this is what was going to happen. Elijah obviously witnesses this. He's right there when it happens. And so he witnesses Elijah's departure from earth, but Elijah was seen no more after that. Now, Elijah's departure is really unique in the scripture. Again, another kind of interesting, unique thing about Elijah and his life, and I don't want to call it the end of life. I'm not sure how to classify this, but he does not die in the traditional sense. Like we read about pretty much every single other person in scripture, where they die, they buried, and, like us all, we are going to die one day. There's only one other person who seems to have something similar to Elijah. That is Enoch. I don't know if we have time to read, but I'll give you the reference. In Genesis chapter 5, verses 21 through 24, it talks about the person named Enoch. This was before the time of the flood, before Noah. It talks about him being a righteous man, and I think it's 300 something, like 354, something like that years. God took him away, and he was not seen anymore, which is sort of what we see here with Elijah. God takes him away in this kind of grand showing, this whirlwind, and then they're not going to see him anymore. He's gone. Now, Enoch, we don't get nearly as much description about his life. Jude talks about him a little bit. But Enoch, when he is taken away, he would not have lived a full life as was considered in those times. In those days, you see people living 500, 600, 700, 800, even 900 years old. Enoch was not even 400 yet by the time that God took him away, which in my mind kind of indicates that he was, quote unquote, younger than most people were of that time when they would die. So Enoch is really interesting just because we don't have really more information about that. But I imagine it's something similar to what we see here in 2 Kings chapter 2, where God takes someone away. They don't die in the traditional sense that we think of. He takes them from the earth. This is a hard thing for us to grasp because this is not something that we witness, not something that we see. It's not described much in Scripture because it happens so rarely, and when it does, we don't get a lot of detail about it, especially with Enoch. God takes him away. That's all we're told. We're not told the mechanics of it or anything like we sort of see here with Elijah. So it's a really interesting thing here that if we're comparing Elijah and Enoch, God would not have done this with Elijah if he was not a righteous man, because it talks about in Genesis, Enoch was taken away because of his righteousness, because of what he was doing. I guess God did not want him to be around the people of the time. It's not exactly clear, again, because we don't have a lot of detail about it, but it does describe Enoch as a righteous, godly man. So in my mind, that would apply to Elijah as well. He was a righteous man. every indication we see about Elijah also points to that. So just kind of an interesting thing happens here that is very different than what we typically see. And then we have here in verse 13, well, before we get to that, I do want to comment on Elisha and his reaction to this. There's a couple interesting things. One, he tears his own clothes when this happens. This would be a sign of grief, distress. I mean, Elijah was his mentor. Elijah was the one he had been with for probably several years, and now he's gone like that. There's nothing that, except for the fact that he knew that this was going to happen. He does not really have time to, I don't know, probably process what has just happened because of the way in which it's happened. So he's in a little bit of distress. He's a little bit, I think, sad about this, which is why he tears his garment in this instance. And he also says, when he speaks of Elijah, he cries out, my father, my father. I don't think he's referring to God the Father here in this instance. I think he's talking about Elijah. Remember back when we talked about 1 Kings chapter 19, when Elijah approaches Elisha for the first time to recruit him, if you will, he puts his cloak over him. And we talked about that instance a little bit when we were reading through that. And a lot of commentators think that sign was used as sort of a symbol of adoption. Like if you were going to adopt a son, you would put your cloak over them to say, this is mine now, you are part of me, you are my family, you're with me now, we are one. And I think this probably adds to this being the case, that Elisha has really now thought of himself as being Elijah's son. I mean, that's the kind of relationship that they've built, even though we know Elisha had his own physical father and mother that he left at the end of 1 Kings chapter 19. We see that Elisha has really developed into being a son to Elijah. I think very similar in the way that Paul and Timothy had this father-son relationship, because Paul is constantly calling Timothy my son. He was not his physical son, but he had adopted him in a way to teach him the things of God, and Timothy had grown up in that teaching. So I think it's sort of a very similar thing to that. And then Elisha, he picks up the cloak from Elijah that had fallen. In fact, with the translation that was read, he takes up the mantle, which I'm pretty sure this is where we get the saying from, taking up the mantle. So he takes up his cloak, and he's going to go back to the bank of the Jordan River. Now, about this cloak real quick before we move on to the next portion of reading, I wonder, and we're not told for sure, if this is the exact same cloak that Elijah had put on Elisha back in 1 Kings chapter 19 when they first met. We're not told, but typically prophets of God did not have a bunch of clothes that they would change out of when they felt like, it's after Labor Day, I can't wear white anymore. Let me change into my other wardrobe here. That was usually not the case. They usually had, just what they needed, not a lot of physical, earthly possessions. It would not surprise me then if this is the exact same cloak that we saw in 1 Kings chapter 19. Again, we're not told, but it would be just, very symbolic, very interesting thing that he is not just having Elijah put this cloak on him in 1 Kings chapter 19, but also in a way putting the mantle on him here at the very end of his time on earth. I was going to say life, but again, I'm not sure if that's the right thing to say there. So just kind of a really interesting thought. I don't have any evidence of that, but it would not surprise me if that was the case. It was a thought I was having when I was putting my notes together. Let's see. Any other thoughts I have on that? I don't think so. Any comments, questions up to verse 13 then? Again, this is kind of a really cool thing that happens. I don't have much to say about the mechanics of it because we really don't understand it. It looks cool when people draw it out and how they think it looked. But I don't really think I have much more to say because Scripture doesn't say much more about it. Jeff, go ahead.
We have to at least address the reaction that many people have to the story, and that this is a rocket ship. And they think that, that God utilized the similar technology that we use to escape Earth's atmosphere. It seems clear that God did want to take Elijah away before he's translated, because we recognize that God is not flesh and blood. So for Elijah to go to the so God wants to take him away to do that, just like he took Jesus away in the body. He ascended up. Enoch did too. Um, it God made the universe. If God wants to use propulsion of some kind, then it's not foreign to God, and it doesn't make him on our level, certainly. We shouldn't be thinking, well, God is like us. No, God is not like man. Just because he might want to use something, and I'm not saying it was a rocket ship, I'm just saying even if it were a rocket ship, even if it was, that certainly would not mean that one day we can gain in technological understanding and knowledge of the universe that we will be like God. That's not the way to be like God, is to learn more about the universe, because the universe is very limited. God is much greater than the universe. But a lot of people will look at this, and I've seen people draw this as some type of a rocket ship, some type of a spaceship that we might recognize. But this is something we need to,
Yeah,
be aware of.
I call that
We see
taking.
that sometimes.
Yeah, I would consider that taking liberties with the text.
Oh,
And that's saying it lightly. I mean, this is not the only time in Scripture where people have supposed like God had bestowed some sort of knowledge or ancient technology that we don't understand or fathom. And the time before the flood is rife with that kind of idea, and I kind of understand why to an extent because we know so little about it. But the thing is, a normal natural tornado can pick up a person. You don't really need something supernatural or high tech to really do that kind of thing. But again, this is not something that is, we have, again, Enoch as an example of one who God took away. Looking at the example of Philip also, we have the spirit that takes Philip and just takes him to another place. We're not really told about exactly how that happens, just the spirit did it. So I get a little, upset is not the word, I guess confused is more the word when people try to insert things into Scripture. Well, God had to do it this way because there's no way it could happen this way. But we don't really know that. Like, how can we even say that? Like, God can't do it this way? Like, that's kind of blasphemous in a way. God can't, fill in the blank. Certainly there are some things in his character they can't do. He cannot lie. He does not sin. He does not tempt. There are all those things. But to say, God couldn't do it in the way it's written kind of takes away from God in a way, and I think we need to be very careful about that. So I don't have any issues with the way the Scripture tells us how it happened, except I wish I had more information. But I don't think it's anything different than what it says, if you will. I just wish I had more.
One other thing, a lot of people believe, and it's probably my opinion too, just an opinion, that Enoch was a prophet in his day.
Yeah.
It's not unlike maybe Elijah was in his day.
And I think what Jude writes about him in the book of Jude indicates that to us as well, because we could turn there real quick. We're almost out of time, but if you go through the book of Jude, there is a quick mention of Enoch and the things he did do in his prophesying. So Jude kind of tells us that. I don't have any doubts about that either. Let's try to finish out. Well, we're not going to finish the chapter. We'll finish out this section. Someone read for us 14 through 18, please. 14 through 18.
Then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and struck the water with it. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. The company of the prophets from Jericho, who were watching, said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. "Look," they said, "we your servants have 50 able men. Let them go and look for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and set him down on some mountain or in some valley."
Keep going through 18.
Elisha replied, "Do not send them." But they persisted until he was too ashamed to refuse. So he said, "Send them." And they sent 50 men who searched for 3 days but did not find him. When they returned to Elisha, who was staying in Jericho, he said to them, "Didn't I tell you not to go?"
Okay, so this will kind of finish out this story here, even though it's not the end of the chapter. So Elisha he's able to divide the Jordan River just like Elijah did, just like it happened in Joshua's time, just like the dividing of the Red Sea under Moses. So we have here kind of proof that did Elisha receive that request, that he got the double portion of the Spirit from Elijah? I think so. I think that is enough evidence. But guess what? The prophets that had come from Jericho and were watching all this from a distance, they see it happen, and they outright say it. They say the spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha. So they see it. I don't think they're incorrect about this. And they go and they pay their respects to Elisha. Elisha is the guy now. He's the prophet of God that God is going to use from here on out. And they recognize that as well. And they also say, you know, perhaps God has taken Elijah somewhere and put him someplace. I mean, Elijah has this reputation for kind of hiding or disappearing, going places when he needs to. I mean, think back to chapter 17 and 18, where Ahab has been searching for him in Israel, in the nations around Israel. They can't find him. He's just been so good at hiding away. So, like, this is something that could have physically happened, that, you know, he's been taken away. But Elisha says, no, he's gone. You're not going to find him. But they insist, so he lets them, you know, go ahead, knock yourselves out. They search for 3 days. They don't find him. They come back and report to him. He says, well, yeah, I told you. Like, I told you so. You're kind of wasting your time. But I guess that is also, again, another proof to Elisha being kind of the prophet that God is going to speak through now, because Elijah's not here anymore. You know, they insisted to go find him. They didn't find him, so they've got Elisha. Elijah's not here anymore. Again, it's probably one of those, you know, great mysteries. You know, did they have Elijah's picture on milk cartons and all that stuff? I'm not sure how they searched for Elijah, but they had 50 men looking for him, but they did not find him. So that's going to be the end of Elijah in this study. Now, next week I was thinking we would go on. What I want to do next week, because we're out of time now, but before we continue on to verse 19 onward, I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of Elijah symbolically after his time on the earth, how the Bible uses his name and describes him and puts him into scriptures both later in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, because I don't think we can have a complete study that involves Elijah without doing that. So next week, we're not going to start right off at verse 19. I'm going to kind of pause, and I'm going to talk about some of the ways that Elijah is talked about and viewed, both in actuality and in symbolism, after his time on the earth, because I think that's an important thing for us to have a better understanding of why Elijah is such an important figure in the scripture. Because if you just look at 1 Kings chapter 18 or 17 through this chapter here, he's just kind of another prophet. There are a lot of guys like Elijah in that respect. Now, there are a few unique things, and we've talked about them through the study so far, but I want to kind of pause and talk more about Elijah before we totally get away from him and focus on Elisha. So we're going to do that next week. So we're going to probably jump around to a lot of places next week, a lot of different scripture. We'll get away from 2 Kings for a little bit, but then we're going to come back. I don't think that'll take the whole time next week. We'll come back and we'll continue in verse 19 onward. Whether or not we'll finish chapter 2 of 2 Kings next week, I'm not sure. Depends on how much talking we get to. You know, that's kind of how it is. But we'll stop there, and then we'll kind of do that next week. Just wanted to give you all a heads up about what I'm thinking. So we're way out of time, but...